Welcome viewers. Today we are going to discuss critical approaches to international relations theory. Before starting the video, I'd like to mention that these are all approaches to international relations as a discipline and not any kind of a theory that we are supposed to know as a critical theory. So, at the very beginning, I would like to differentiate that these are certainly all the approaches taken together and not the critical theory of international relations we know. But certainly, we have considered critical theory within these critical approaches. There are different types of critical approaches that we know there are in the discipline of international relations. There are Marxism, Neo-Marxism and critical theory, Constructivism, Poststructuralism, Postcolonialism, feminism and green politics. In order to explain all these theories in a brief and concise manner, we have excluded feminism and green politics in this video and tried to give a brief narrative of all the other approaches, for example, Marxism, Neo-Marxism, Constructivism, Poststructuralism and Postcolonialism in this video. But before going into that, let us understand why they are clubbed together as a critical approaches, or rather, to define it in another term, that why they are known as critical approaches. Mainstream perspectives on international politics and world affairs have been challenged by a growing array of certain perspectives which are known as critical perspectives, and they have only gained prominence since the late 1980s. Although these perspectives are often very different from one another, they tend to have two broad things in common. The first is that with the exception of orthodox Marxism and the most forms of green politics, or as popularly known as environmental politics, they have in their different ways embraced a certain post-positivist approach that takes subject and object, and therefore theory and practice, to be intimately linked. That means the theory and practice both are linked intimately to understand the essence of the international relations. The second similarity is related to the first, and this is that the critical perspectives seeks to challenge the global status quo and the norms, values, assumptions on which it is based. Thus, in exposing inequalities and asymmetries that mainstream theories like liberalism, realism, they ignore, critical theorists therefore tend to view all these theories, all these mainstream theories, as way of concealing or of legitimizing the power imbalances of the established global system. Thus, the critical theories are basically the emancipatory theories. They are also known as emancipatory theories. That means they are dedicated to overthrowing oppression and thus consciously align themselves with the interests of the exploited groups. So, being politically engaged, it is sometimes difficult to reconcile critical theories, or to be very fair, the critical approaches, with the tradition of dispassionate scholarship. They argue the highlights and they want to highlight the limitations of the traditional theories like the realist and the liberalists, rather than to argue about what they are in their own form. Let us begin with Marxism and its allied theories. We have taken Marxism, neo-Marxism and critical theories at a bunch. So in order to understand the various nuances of higher theories, Marxism has traditionally been viewed as the principal critical alternative to mainstream realist and liberal thinking, although its impact on academic theorizing was very limited. In case of this academic theorizing, I would like to mention that academic theorizing of international relations theory. However, Marxism is a very broad field which encompasses, as far as international theory is concerned, two contrasting tendencies. The first of these give primary attention to economic analysis and is mainly concerned with exposing capitalism as a system of class operation that operates on national and international levels. This applies to classical Marxism and to most of the forms of neo-Marxism. The second tendency places greater emphasis on the ideological and cultural dimension of oppression and has come to embrace a post-positivist and therefore post-Marxist mode of theorizing. This applies to what has been called the critical theory, or as influenced by the ideas of Gramsci and the so-called Frankfurt School. Now let us understand the journey from classical Marxism to Marxism. The core of Marxism is a philosophy of history that outlines why capitalism is doomed and why socialism and eventually communism are destined to replace it. This philosophy is based on all we know that the materialist conception of history. The belief, that means the materialist conception of history, can be stated as that the economic factors are the ultimate determining force in history. In Marx's view, history is driven forward through a dialectical process in which internal contradictions within each mode of production reflected in class conflict led to social revolution and the construction of a new and higher mode of production. This process was characterized by a series of historical stages: slavery, feudalism, capitalism, and so on, and would only end with the establishment of a classless communist society. However, the implications of viewing capitalism as an international system were not fully explored until V.I. Lenin's imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Lenin portrayed imperialism as an essentially economic phenomenon, reflecting domestic capitalism quest to maintain profit level through the export of surplus capital. Interest in Marxism later revived during the 1970s through the use of neo-Marxist theories to explain patterns of global poverty and inequality. Dependency theory is one of the example, which highlighted the extent to which in the post-1945 period traditional imperialism had given way to neocolonialism, sometimes viewed as economic imperialism, or more specifically dollar imperialism. World systems theory is another, which suggested that the world economy is best understood as an interlocking capitalist system which exemplifies at international level many of the features of that characterize national capitalism, that is, structural inequalities based on exploitation and a tendency towards instability and crisis that is rooted in economic contradictions of both the national and the international. Thus, the world system consists of various interrelationships between the core, the periphery, and the semi-periphery. We will try to discuss these explanations of core, periphery, and the semi-periphery when we will deal with these dependency and world system theory in a separate video. Later on, critical theory, or often called as Frankfurt School critical theory, try to distinguish the exploitation from a wider category which is known as critical theories, and developed into one of the most influential currents of Marxist inspired international theory. A major influence on critical theory has been the ideas of Gramsci, Antonio Gramsci. He argued that capitalist class system is upheld not simply by some unequal economic and political power, but by what he termed the hegemony of bourgeois ideas and theories. By hegemony, he means leadership or domination, and in the sense of ideological hegemony, it refers to the capacity of bourgeois ideas to displace rival views and become, in effect, the common sense of the age. The other key influence on critical theory has been the thinking of the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School is a group of Marxist-influenced theorists who worked at the Institute of Social Research, established in Frankfurt in 1923, relocated to the USA in 1930s, and was re-established in Frankfurt in the early 1950s. And unfortunately, the institute was dissolved in 1969. The defining theme of critical theory is the attempt to extend the notion of critique to all social practices by linking substantive social research to philosophy. Leading Frankfurt thinkers included Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, Max Horkheimer, and the leading exponent of the second generation of the Frankfurt School was Jürgen Habermas. All the Frankfurt School theorists tried to imply that as all theorizing is a normative, those who seek to understand the world should adopt greater theoretical reflexivity. What do we mean by this term theoretical reflexivity? Theoretical reflexivity is basically an awareness of the impact of the values and presuppositions that a theorist bring to analysis. Hence, the normative sense of the terms are most important for understanding international relations. Thus, it brings an understanding of the historical dynamics that have helped to fashion them. Thus, critical theorists have adopted an explicit commitment to emancipatory politics. They are concerned to uncover structures of oppression and injustice in global politics. They have also questioned the conventional association within international theory between political community and the state. In so, they really opens up the possibility of a more inclusive and maybe even cosmopolitan notion of political identity. Constructivism, sometimes called social constructivism, has been the most influential post-positivist approach to international theory, gaining significantly greater attention since the end of the Cold War. The constructivist approach to analysis is based on the belief that there is no objective social or political reality independent of our understanding of it. That means the constructivists do not, therefore, regard the social world as something that exists outside in the sense of an external world of concrete objects. But they consider that it exists only inside as a kind of a intersubjective awareness. In their analysis, people, whether acting as an individual or as social groups, construct the world in which they live and act according to those constructions. That is why people's beliefs, attitudes, and assumptions became so significant and have widely shared. So, constructivists analyzes the missing dimension in the agent and the state's structures. Agents here being the individuals, and the structures are the state structures. Constructivism stands, in a sense, between these inside out and outside in approaches, that it holds that interactions between agents and structures are always mediated by ideational factors. Ideational factors means the beliefs, values, theories, and assumptions of individuals. Because these ideational factors affect both how agents see themselves, that means how individuals see themselves, and how they understand and respond to the structures, that is, the structures of the state within which they operate. So, the most important part of the constructivism comes from the formulations of Alexander Wendt's assertion that anarchy is what states make of it. In his book Social Theory of International Politics, published in 1999, he tried to make that an anarchy is that which remains with the state. This implies that state behavior is not determined, as neorealists assert, by the structure of the international system, but by how particular states view anarchy. While some states may view anarchy as dangerous and threatening, others may see it as the basis for freedom and opportunity. What is at stake here is not the objective circumstances that confront a state so much as a state's self-identity and it views its fellow states. This can also be seen in relation to nations and nationalisms. Nations are not objective entities, groups of people who happen to share a common cultural heritage. Rather, they are subjective entities, defined by their members through a particular set of traditions, values, and sentiments. Constructivist analysis highlights the fluidity of world politics as nation states and other key global actors change their perception of who or what and how their behavior will change. This stance may have optimistic or pessimistic implications, but on the one hand, it leaves open the possibility that states may transcend a narrow perception of self-interest and embrace the cause of global justice, even cosmopolitanism. On the other hand, it highlights that possibility that states and other international actors may fall prey to expansionist and aggressive political greeds. Poststructuralism emerged alongside postmodernism, the two terms sometimes being used interchangeably. Poststructuralism emphasizes that all ideas and concepts are expressed in language, which itself is enmeshed in complex relations of power. Influenced particularly by the writings of Michel Foucault, poststructuralists have drawn attention to the link between power and systems of thought using the idea of discourse or discourses of power, which in very crude terms implies that knowledge is power. However, in the absence of a universal frame of reference or overarching perspective, there exists only a series of competing perspectives, each of which represents a particular discourse of power. So, sometimes it has been associated with Jacques Derrida and his famous formulation, that is, there is nothing outside the text. and sometimes it has seriously exerted growing influence on international theory when it happened to be the publication of Derian and Shapiro's International and Intertextual, the publication of the book in 1989, and hence drawing attention to the fact that any political event will always be susceptible to competing interpretations. For example, the incident of 9/11. Not only is there, for post-structuralists, the debate that comes about whether 9/11 is best conceived as an act of terrorism, or as an criminal act, or an act of evil, or an act of possibly justified revenge. But there is also uncertainty about the nature of the act itself. Was it the attacks themselves? It is the process, or is the process of planning, the formation of Al Qaeda, the onset of US neocolonialism, or whatever. If you think any one of these as the possible determinants of the 9/11 incident, please comment on the comment section of my channel. But whatever it is, in such circumstances, the classic post-structuralist approach to exposing hidden meanings in particular concepts, theories, and interpretations is deconstruction. Thus, the post-structuralist basically views not a single approach idea of international relations, but the idea of IR coming from various perspectives, locating in the idea of power. Postcolonialism. It is for this video the final critical perspective on global politics. Theorists of postcolonialism have tried to expose the cultural dimension of colonial rule, usually by establishing the legitimacy of non-Western and sometimes anti-Western ideas, cultures, and traditions. For example, in one of the most influential works of post-colonial theory, Edward Said developed the notion of Orientalism to highlight the extent to which cultural and political hegemony over the rest of the world, but over the Orient in particular, had been maintained through elaborate stereotypical fictions that belittled and demeaned non-Western people and culture. For example, there are various such stereotypes include images such as the mysterious East, inscrutable Chinese, lustful Turks, and etc. One of them prominent among all these are the white man's burden, which is particularly noteworthy. The cultural biases generated by colonialism do not only affect and subjugate former colonized people, they also have a continuing impact on Western states, which assume the mantle of the international community in claiming the authority to sort out less favored parts of the world. In this view, humanitarian intervention can be seen as one of the greatest example of Eurocentrism. By Eurocentrism, I mean the application of values and theories drawn from European culture to other groups and peoples, implying basically a biased and distorted viewpoint. Hence, forcible intervention on allegedly humanitarian grounds, and for that matter other forms of interference in the developing world such as international aid, can therefore be viewed as continuation of colonialism by other means. Thank you. If you do like the video, please share and subscribe to my channel Basics of Political Science.